It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's festivities. And I'm going to be very short. I simply want to alert to you that if you've enjoyed tonight's lecture, which I think you will be sure to want to come in May, where we have our spring quarter lecture by Jessica Stockholder, who is a new professor in the Division of Visual Arts and a world-renowned sculptress, and she will be speaking to us on the provocative title of Parallel Parking. So I hope you will all come out on May 14th and hear Jessica speak. But for tonight, I am happy to turn over the duties of introduction to my colleague, Michael Silverstein, professor in the Department of Linguistics, in Anthropology, and in Psychology, who will do the honor of introducing tonight's guest. Michael?
Today, on the 205th anniversary, the birth anniversary of Charles Darwin and Illinois' own Abraham Lincoln, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Haun Saussy, another tall son of a neighboring border state, Tennessee in this case, who has made his way to the University of Chicago via Duke University, UCLA, Stanford, and Yale. Among his colleagues, he's not just a university professor in comparative literature, East Asian languages and civilizations, and social thought. He's a veritable universal professor, able to meet all of us with fresh and interesting, and most importantly, informed ideas for our own diverse fields. In my own areas of anthropology and linguistics, non-written verbal art, oral literature of the titles of today's talk, has long been a central concern. Professor Saussy, who professes on his website Print Culture to be, and I quote, allergic to boredom, his own as well as others, unquote, will, I am certain, prevent ours by spinning us an enchanting and illuminating tale. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Haun Saussy.
Good evening. As you know, the two main divisions of scholarly labor are nailing jelly to a wall and herding cats. I will be doing both tonight. The jelly I am taking in hand is the concept of oral literature, and the pack of mutually antagonistic cats includes Julius Caesar, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Johann Gottfried Herder, Michael Silverstein's teacher, Roman Jakobson, and many less famous thinkers, mostly from the last 2 centuries. I often think how much easier it would be to take a nicely defined, solid, flattish object and nail it to a freshly sanded wall. Such enterprises do exist. And how much friendlier it would be to ask a species endowed with a strong instinct for cooperation to help me by fetching the hammer or holding the nail in place. But the fascination of what's difficult, as Yeats named it, has kept me thinking about oral literature for more years than I feel comfortable sharing with you tonight. What follows is an interim report on the project of making sense of the jelly and the cats. It's too easy to say that oral literature is a self-contradictory phrase, that literature implies letters and oral implies the lack of letters. What's fascinating and difficult about the subject is the way the songs and sagas of people who are not in the habit of writing surface in literate culture. They surface first as examples of technological backwardness, then as transcribed samples of text, and eventually as sounds that can be captured by a recording machine. They appear often indirectly, not in their own right, but as wards of their next friends, as they say in family court, the scribes and scholars who are capable of writing for them and about them, and thus preserve an image of otherwise evanescent creativity. And this position of being spoken for, or rather written for, by people who are not identical to them in either status or preoccupation leads to a variety of knotty intellectual problems, that we who have mainly a written record to go on must find ways of compensating for or reverse engineering against. What distortions are introduced in an oral text when it is reduced to writing? What unconscious expectations about the character and purpose of text frame an utterance when it comes into writing from the space outside literacy? Some of the experience that I've found useful comes from working with my thesis advisor, Kang-Yi Sun Zhang, on an anthology of poetry ascribed to women from pre-20th century China. As we dug our way through the textual record, we found ourselves not just documenting the history of women who wrote, that would have been nice, but it was a little too simple. Rather, we were confronting the many purposes that men over the centuries had had for sponsoring women into print, or appropriating their voices to express their own problems, or even disguising themselves as women in hopes of getting a broader hearing than they might have had otherwise on the grounds of novelty. The fiduciary issues, to lapse into legal vocabulary again, were deep and complex. I learned to be suspicious of editors, not forgetting that I was acquiring that suspicion through being an editor. So, setting up to do something with the concept of oral literature, the first question is, of course, what is it? Some of the writers on the subject would think that a stupid question, because the answer is so obvious. Oral literature is composition of song, lyric, or epic by people using only their voices to articulate and transmit their thoughts. An oral poet is a poet minus writing. This line of thought tends to an ostensive definition, a definition by pointing to examples. Here's an example from the Faroe Islands, and here's an example from Madagascar, and here's an example from the Sahara, and here's an example from Mongolia. But this is not very ambitious theoretically. Cowboy poetry is poetry written by cowboys is logically unassailable, but doesn't tell you anything you didn't already know, and may in fact miss the point if we were to discover that cowboy poetry is largely composed in air-conditioned offices in Nashville, Tennessee, and only gets sung out on the range. Not to take anything away from Tex Ritter et confrères, but if we discovered that this was the actual state of affairs, we would not then declare that there is absolutely nothing more to say about cowboy poetry, case closed. We get into a more ambitious zone when we see people trying to characterize oral poetry, which typically means defining it in its difference from written poetry. From this, we might go to a theory of the different formal features of the two kinds of poetry, a theory that would put up a claim for the universal usefulness of the category oral poetry, covering examples from Greenland to Fiji, and perhaps even aspire to tell us something about the evolution of the human mind under different technological conditions. But here I find the record, though copious, somewhat disappointing. There are, of course, plenty of theories about writing and what it does to human societies, not just in their modes of communication, but in their memories, their political orders, their ways of imagining the relations of body and soul, and so forth. For a time in the 1960s, under the joint pressure of Marshall McLuhan, Jack Goody, Walter Ong, and Eric Havelock, it seemed to be an obligatory theme, developing into such flora as the study of popular culture and the ethnography of performance. It has since retreated into the undercroft of media theory, whence I think it should be excavated, not to revive it in its 1960s form, but to give it a good hard look and ask questions about what assumptions it makes about the unaccommodated human, the person without writing, or, we too easily suppose, without other technologies of memory and transmission. The time is ripe for this, I think, because recent work in the history of technology and in the relations of mind and body permit us to see the human being differently from our historical forebears, and to propose that the human has always been a technologically augmented being, is always leaving traces out in the world, always reading the signs of the past, never unformatted. And in this enterprise, the notion of oral literature, in all its jelly-like amorphousness, can turn out to be a convenient solvent for old encrusted ideas. But here I am selling an article I don't exactly have in prototype. So let me back up and offer a question subsidiary to this revision of the place of the oral in human technological history. we should first hear the question, what is oral literature, as suggesting rather, when and how did oral literature become an object of discourse? And to that, I have an answer, the curious history I promised you. Presumably, oral literature goes back as far as language. Oral literature becomes something that people write about at moments when their written culture bumps up against a non-written culture that for some reason impresses or frustrates it. You wouldn't find a lot of attention given in ancient Greek and Roman texts to the fact that the villagers of Boeotia don't spend their evenings curled up with a good book. The illiteracy of the peasantry is absolutely taken for granted. The relative literacy of urban dwellers in the ancient world does get some ancient attention, usually when somebody has a complaint about it. The following text from Julius Caesar's narration of the Gallic Wars is exceptional, and I will linger over it for a while. Caesar says in Book 6, the lore, he uses the word disciplina, of the Druids is thought to have been transmitted to Gaul from Britain, where it originated. Those who most eagerly wish to acquire it go there for the sake of study. There they are said to learn by heart a great number of verses, and not a few of them spend up to 20 years in study. Nor is it considered in keeping with divine law to commit these verses to writing, though the Gauls use Greek letters for almost all other kinds of public or private business. It seems to me, says Caesar continuing, this is the only place where he says me in the Gallic Wars, by the way, it seems to me that this rule was established for two reasons. One, that they did not wish this lore to be acquired by ordinary people, and two, that they did not wish the learners to rely on letters and therefore apply themselves less strenuously to memorizing, as generally happens to those who, through the help of writing, lose their facility of learning and their memory. Thus far, Caesar. Okay, so the Gauls possessed a vast and complex body of knowledge about the gods, the soul, cosmology, and geography. Many of their youth spend up to 20 years acquiring it by memorizing a vast number of verses. Up to this point, the Gauls' system of education sounds like that of well-born Romans. A grounding in the poetic corpus constituting what Havelock would call their tribal encyclopedia, a progression to more speculative areas of knowledge, and a period of study abroad. Homer, Plato, Athens, right? You recognize the stages. Caesar's imaginary hearer must be impressed by the figure of 20 years for a well-rounded Gaulish education. The first word of the next sentence, which begins, neque fas esse existimant, responds to possible objections in the previous sentence. Not only do they spend 20 years in education, that's your first surprise, but they don't even use writing for their voluminous sacred teaching. Second surprise. And the word fas, used by Caesar, suggests a divine or ritual prohibition, as if the hearer is amazed and saying, how can that be? And Caesar answers by raising the seriousness of the prohibition. Caesar then, using the first person, as I said, for the only time in the Gallic Wars, ventures two explanations. The Gauls forbade writing their wisdom down to keep it from falling in the hands of the undeserving, or to protect their memories from writing-initiated decay. Both these justifications are drawn from Plato's Phaedrus, the dialogue where Socrates dismisses writing as a shortcut to wisdom. The analogy Caesar makes here is quite the complement to the Gauls. Right? They are not just strange people who paint themselves blue and live in the woods, but they have a culture that is the equivalent of the most refined culture that a Roman could imagine. So here we have a division in two parts, as Caesar would say, of the field of information among the Gauls. Everyday business, where writing is permitted, and the realm of the sacred, where it is forbidden to use writing. Oral tradition is marked out by this interdiction as the field of greater value. Unlike the failure to write, which could be ascribed to any barbarians, and of course was again and again, the Druids' refusal to write puts their learning among mysteries that Caesar's page or any page cannot contain. The reason for lingering on this passage is that Caesar here imagines, in writing, a culture in which writing is not the normative member of the pair writing-orality. It's usually the other way around. This surprising statement coming from a writing man would not often be echoed in the following 1800 years. I will take my next cue from the recent book by my colleague Larry Norman, The Shock of the Ancient, which recounts the quarrel in 17th century Paris between writers who maintained that the ancients were the sum of cultural attainment and the models for all time, and those who upheld the achievements of Louis XIV's France, the moderns, as unprecedented achievements that outshone whatever the ancients had done. Much of the controversy between those pro-ancients and pro-moderns hinged on Homer. New translations had recently come out, and Homer began to appear in sharper focus than before. Now, the awkward transitions, the inconsistencies, disproportions, cruelties, and crudities of his heroic epics were in print for all to see. A secular cleric named François Hédelin, whose title was Abbé d'Aubignac, wrote a pamphlet arguing that Homer was not a good poet and never even existed. The Iliad and the Odyssey were, according to d'Aubignac, full of weaknesses and violations of common sense. As Larry puts it, sloppy poem, sloppy poet. The explanation of the epic's flaws is to be found in the history of their composition, as the Abbé reconstructs it. Hymns celebrating the age of heroes, originally performed in princely courts, fell into the public domain and were sung by minstrels and beggars. I quote, "Since these verses were now common property, always in the mouths of low-class people and beggars, no one valued them, and no study came to improve this poetry. It was recited everywhere, even on the street corners, which could well have caused the dissipation of the work through negligence or through contempt." Right, so Homer is being dragged down quite a number of steps. Out of his reputation, out of the debris of his reputation, there emerges the beggar's monody as the lowest of the low literary genres. The fact that the Iliad and the Odyssey might derive from orally circulated texts is, for d'Aubignac, a good reason to disdain them. And that's all the explanation we need for their incoherence and poor taste. A self-aware age of criticism added the hypothesis of oral transmission to its repertoire of devices for purifying literary taste. Similarly, and almost at the same time, with Spinoza and Richard Simon, biblical studies called on a period of oral transmission of the scriptures as a way of accounting for their otherwise incomprehensible variability and contradictoriness. In all this, the constant factor is the assumption that oral poets are not really in control of themselves. Their memory fails them, they can't plan ahead, they're unoriginal, they are constitutionally incapable of producing finished, rational, classical work. And that is why we should drop the ancients and embrace the moderns. All right, that's the argument. Well, this position couldn't be left without an answer. My whole presentation today could be covered with the title of a polemic dating some 45 years after the initial salvos, showing how durable the effects of the controversy of the ancients and moderns were. This is Homer Avenged by François Gacon, published in 1715. In the frontispiece, you see a vain and grasping critic attempting to pull Homer's statue off the peak of its renown, but succeeding only in grasping its shadow. But the real vengeance of Homer was achieved not by accusing the critics of blindness and wicked ambition, but by changing the standards by which Homer was to be judged. Rivals to the neoclassical norms famously began to appear in the middle 18th century with Vico, Rousseau, and Herder in what seems like an early version of Romanticism. Vico claimed that Homer was a fictional embodiment of collective creativity, the mind of the heroic age that spoke in metaphors and images. Rousseau contended that the poetry of Homer, had it been written, would never have achieved the status of song. Herder took the question in a comparative direction by compiling and prefacing 2 anthologies of world primitive folk songs in the 1770s. Katie Trumpeter has chronicled the emergence of the imaginary figure of the national bard as an important means for thinking through the transition between autocratic and representative government over the course of the 18th century, and shown its relation to the problem of assimilating outlying regions, such as Scotland, to the political centers. Herder obviously has censorious critics like d'Aubignac in mind when he throws the following in the face of French neoclassicism. And I'll quote, "Homer's rhapsodies and the songs of Ossian were alike impromptus, because at the time nothing existed but impromptus. After Ossian came the minstrels, and they followed until art came and extinguished nature. Look through the poems of Ossian. In all the circumstances of bardic song, they are so similar to another people that is still living, singing, and performing deeds on the earth." And here he's referring to the native peoples of North America. When the Greenlander, or what we might know colloquially as an Eskimo, when the Greenlander tells of his pursuit of seals, he does not recount, but paints with words and gestures every event, every moment, since all of these are parts of the image in his soul. And when he gives the eulogy and the farewell over a departed friend, he does not praise or lament, he paints. And the very life of the dead man, summoned up with all the force of imagination, must speak and shout. This Greenlander follows the most precise rules of the elegy genre. And from whom did he learn them? That rhetorical question by Herder is meant to remain unanswered. Unanswered. You're supposed to say, aha, this perfect elegy emerges naturally from the situation and the sensibility of the poet, without having to be learned from any manual. And if we were only as careful to keep intact our experience and vision and not to follow antique precedents, we might write with the same vitality as Homer. All right, so here's the response to d'Aubignac's case for throwing away the ancients. Well, you see where this is going. Toward the 19th century's idealization of the folk as the repository of true national identity and of one's own national culture as deserving to be defended and cherished against some so-called cosmopolitan ideal, usually French. But the French had their own secret stocks of local culture and belief to be shielded from the acquisitiveness of Parisian centralism. Just ask a Breton or a Gascon or a Provençal, etc., etc. Such broad views of national and popular song put oral literature in a newly conspicuous place, indeed on a pedestal. Folklore collectors, following the example of the Grimms, fanned out to document the customs and sayings of the people, each in their own country. A discipline of folklore grew up to connect the countryside with the libraries and academies. Jacob Grimm's saying was widely quoted, "Das Volk dichtet," or "the people are the makers of their own poetry." He seems, however, not to have said it in quite those words. But the 19th century, if it starts out with liberations and enthusiasms, turns past its midpoint into the century of positivism, oh so dreary, and compilation of factual matter, preferably to be digested in tabular form and reissued as some law. "Where has a folk ever been seen to compose a poem?" asked some of these reasonable later 19th century people. And the answer came out of observation, imagination, and analogy. As George Lyman Kittredge sketched it out in 1904, "In a small tribal gathering," I quote, "there is no such diversity of intellectual interests as characterizes even the smallest company of civilized men. There is unity of feeling and a common stock, however slender, of ideas and traditions. Members of a singing, dancing throng, subjected as a unit to mental and emotional stimulus, sing, on the spur of the moment, phrases that, summed up, make a song, chanted back in refrain by the whole group. A song," says Kittredge, "made in this way is no man's property and has no individual author. The folk is its author." End of quotation. And things don't stop there. As it is recited and bandied about, it will, of course, change, whether through adaptation, mishearing, or augmentation. The process is not complete, however, until, I quote again, "until the folk accepts the gift and subjects it to that course of oral tradition which is essential to the production of a genuine ballad." So here are the ingredients, according to Kittredge: common sensibility under strong stimulus, individual utterance repeated in chorus, acceptance by a community of the production, and its further circulation in a wider world, whereby it becomes truly common property. This model of folk production of poetry could be inflected in various ways. Different scholars insisted on one or another dimension of it. on the formulaic repetitive character of the verses that composed a normal folk poem, that would be the work of John Mayer in the 1890s, or on its generality, as befitted a song that would be used in many different circumstances, like a mass-produced valentine. One German folklorist named Hans Naumann insisted particularly on the uniformity of the folkish mind. In a true folk, there could be no divergence of opinions because a divided folk would be incapable of poetic production. They might be reduced to argumentation. He also seems to have doubted the creativity of the folk, for, as Naumann construed it, most folk songs were decayed and detached fragments of courtly poetry that had somehow fallen into the hands of the common people. The common people who reproduced, not produced, poetry by misunderstanding it and singing it every which way. He says, das Volk zersingt ein Lied. People missing a song. You might recognize here the same model that had served d'Aubignac in 1664 for rejecting Homer as just another blind singer recycling snips and scraps from the dumpsters of the noble courts. Naumann's strongly dismissive views of the folk would make him an unlikely folklorist and probably worthy of automatic dismissal today, were it not that one of the most brilliant contributions to the debate on oral literature, Roman Jakobson and Piotr Bogatyryov's Folklore as a Specific Mode of Creativity, published in 1929, were not in large part directed against his theories. Jakobson and Bogatyryov, one a linguist and the other an ethnographer, bring to the discussion of folklore a new model taken from the linguistics of Ferdinand de Saussure, still quite new in the world in 1929. For them, the ambiguity and jelly-like character of the idea of oral poetry, the folk, and collective composition resolves once we put these in the framework of langue and parole devised by Saussure. Langue or language is a system of units and rules that makes communication possible. Parole or speech is the individual act of communication relying on that system. Thus, the folk as a whole is the collective author of langue, language, a body of conventions so huge and so complexly interrelated that no single person could have made it up. And the random individual in the crowd who is moved to sing a verse using the words of the tribe is expressing himself in parole. But that is true of any act of speech, even the speaking I am doing in front of you right now. What singularizes folklore for Jakobson and Bogatyryov, there's Bogatyryov, what singularizes folklore is that the parole of the individual speaker is then fed back into the shared consciousness of the group. It must be remembered and repeated in order to become an ingredient of common culture. And what the community as a whole is willing to remember is, by and large, what fits with their ideas of what is beautiful, right, just, and good. An eccentric or overly individual act of speaking will fail to be understood. It will not be remembered. It will fall out of the vocabulary of the community's folklore. Jakobson and Bogatyryov call this process of winnowing and forgetting preventive censorship. The folk does compose poetry, we see, but it composes with scissors. The authorship of the work of folklore is a kind of collaboration between the member of the community and the average of what everyone else can understand and retain. The cats, in short, heard themselves. Now, some elements of this picture were already to be found in Kittredge, who commented on the ballad in 1904 by saying, "We may compare the processes of language. A word is created by somebody. It then becomes the property of the whole body of those who speak the language and is subjected to continuous modification from generation to generation." End of quote. But the understanding of what a language is, not just a collection of words, but a totality that in many ways organizes and balances itself independent of the will of any speaker, gives an extra force to Jakobson and Bogatyryov's claim that, I quote, "A fundamental difference between folklore and literature is that folklore is set specifically toward langue, while literature is set toward parole." In literature, censorship is fairly relaxed. You can get messages by. A book might be published, languish on the shelves for a long time, and someone will eventually rediscover it. But In folklore, we have, as they say, an inseparable fusion of censorship and work, right? The production and the censorship are part of the same process. Like the dream in Freud's theory of dreaming, folklore is not simply mutilated by censorship, it is also partly created by it. The poet, then, is a special type of participant in oral poetic creation. Further research, they say, will need to clarify the functions, limits, inner structures, and rules of a given community's folklore, exactly as if one were describing the grammar of a recently discovered language. Only here, the language is built on top of an existing language, the language of ordinary communication in that society. Here, then, oral poetry or folklore has really become a thing in its own right, and not merely the symptom of the deprivation of literacy. On censorship and Jakobson and Bogatyryov's essay, there is something more to say. They emphatically reject Hans Naumann's account of the primitive cultural community, which I mentioned earlier, you remember, in which there is, quote, no individualism, all are inspired by the same emotions and thoughts. And of course they reject his theory that the content of folklore is used goods that have fallen off the truck of high culture. Now, Hans Naumann was a powerful folklorist in Germany in the 1920s. And 4 years after the publication of Jakobson and Bogatyryov's essay, he would both join the Nazi Party and be chosen as rector of the University of Bonn. In his capacity as rector, he ordered and supervised one of the first book burnings in Nazi Germany, casting on the flames hundreds of volumes that he described as undeutsch, un-German. Here is the primitive censure of the community, discovered by Jakobson and Bogatyryov, rejecting everything that is alien to it, but carried out in the most clumsy and futile way under the conditions of print culture. So to circle round, folk poetry is not a collection of poems, it is a multiple, collective way of composing. Because it is multiple, it includes variants, which are indistinguishable from errors. Because it is collective, each poet is really a performer or a reciter and creates only by necessity and accident. Such oral composing subsists because the poets are supported by a social body, at once their best audience and their most pitiless censors. As Kittredge put it, there are texts, but no text. Texts, but no text. That sums up for me the vital interest of this field, where the works we should study are virtual or potential works, like the outcomes of a future game of which we know only some of the rules and some of the past matches. The scholars of orality who were fascinated by process were drawn to psychology, embodiment, gesture, the disciplines of enactment and performance, and that, I think, is where the discipline should be going. Thank you very much.